Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, the 21st of June, 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. And we're going to be joined by live video Skype link by Vanessa Beeley, who has already told us that the weather in the south of France is apparently gorgeous.
Yes.
It shouldn't be allowed. Not to worry, it's going to be standardised under European regulations, unless we stop that in a hurry. Weather across the rest of UK is generally warm, some sunny spells, cloudy, muggy in a few places, and not too bad in Plymouth. Well, the EUReferendumPsyOp, Mike, must be the start.
No, it's not.
Okay.
We're starting with Joe Cox.
Oh, sorry, it's not connected.
No.
Okay.
Joe Cox, right. So there was a fundraiser started almost immediately. The news broke of her passing. And that has raised £1.12 million so far. So that's good. Let's have a look at what they're going to spend the money on. Here we go. The Royal Voluntary Service, Hope Not Hate, and finally the White Helmets, Brian. So here we go. The White Helmets, it says on the fundraising page, is a volunteer search and rescue workers in Syria, unarmed and neutral. These heroes have saved more than 51,000 lives from under the rubble and bring hope to the region. Vanessa, we've covered this over the last couple of weeks, over the last couple of months, I should say. Once again, this is not really a fair description, is it?
No, it isn't. And as I've just expressed in the article that's just been put up on 21st Century Wire, in my opinion, we're seeing really a cynical and a hideous exploitation of this murder of a rising UK political figure to what can we say, to give credibility back to a US and NATO organization that is being used to create, if you like, a shadow state on the ground inside Syria. And so are we seeing an obscene exploitation of Joe Cox's murder to give back credit to this organization that has been discredited by a number of reports from the middle of last year up until now, and is attempting to sustain them as first responders for the US and NATO, Nusra and Al-Qaeda forces on the ground in Syria?
This is the key point, isn't it? They are only in terrorist-held areas, and I mean, they could be described as Al-Qaeda in Syria.
They are. I mean, we've seen them. We've shown, and as I said, the collection of videos, articles, and interviews has been put up onto 21st Century Wire so that everybody can basically go there, and the information has been condensed. But we've examined the fact that they are embedded only in al-Nusra and ISIS areas, and this has actually been admitted by the Telegraph itself after one of our primary articles. It's funded by the UK government and the United States government via US aid. There are also some contributions coming in from European countries like Holland, Germany, France, and this we're also investigating exactly what the full amounts are, but we know that 4 million has come in from the Dutch government. We know that this organization acts as, if you like, an intravenous line into those terrorist areas, which we also know to be proxy US and NATO armies on the ground in Syria. And these organizations, these humanitarian first responders, are acting, as I said, as an intravenous line, as a conduit for arms, for equipment, for medical supplies, and for medical treatment of these terrorist factions.
Well, we're going to come on to that a little bit later, but let's just mention this photograph. Philip Hammond there. And who's that he's with in the white helmet?
Well, interestingly, there he's being photographed in southern Turkey at a White Helmets training ground in January 2016. And he's next to, in the white helmet, as you rightly point out, he's next to Raed Saleh. Now, Raed Saleh, as we know, was deported on April the 18th. From Dulles Airport in the United States. Now, for 2 weeks, we weren't given the reasons why. And finally, Mark Toner, United States State Department spokesperson, was pinned down. And he admitted that there was a high likelihood of extremist connections, and that was why Raed Saleh had been deported. So we have to ask ourselves, one, why is our foreign minister being seen fraternizing with a known terrorist agent, Raed Saleh, a known member of Al-Qaeda? And why then is the British public now on the back of a dreadful murder that has literally only just happened? Why is the general public being asked to fund an organization that has links, extremist connections?
But unfortunately, it's not just the Conservative government, it's also the Labour Party that are absolutely seem to be behind promoting the white helmets.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is an extraordinary turn, if you like, of propaganda, where we're seeing this organization, which we know to be being used to set up a shadow state inside Syria. The US and NATO regime change is basically failing, thanks to the resistance of the Syrian people, the Syrian government, and the Syrian Arab Army on the ground in Syria. So what we're seeing, and we're seeing a huge amount of UK financial involvement in this, is the creation of a shadow state, the creation of the Free Syrian Police that's being funded, I think, around 4 million by the UK Foreign Office. The shadow first responders, because we have to remember there are existing first responders on the ground in Syria. There is if you like, the real Syria civil defense that you won't see wearing white helmets and you will never see being portrayed as heroes in the Western media, and yet they are digging people out of the rubble when they're being massacred by the terrorist hell cannon, for example, in Aleppo. But these people are never mentioned. They're marginalized and dehumanized virtually by this creation, by this US NATO creation, the white helmets.
Okay, well, look, here is the article on 21st Century War. Who are the Syria White Helmets? Go and have a read at that. It covers it pretty well. Vanessa, I know you're wanting to get away at some point, but if you were able to hang on for a little bit longer, there's something I'd like to get some comment on in a few articles' time. But in the meantime, let me just bring this up. This is from RUSI. Remind me what RUSI stands for?
Royal United Services Institute.
Right, okay. And this is, they are suggesting that right-wing terrorism, as they're describing it, lone actor terrorism, does more harm than Islamic terrorism. And what they're saying, this report is, they say that as intelligence agencies and law enforcement have become increasingly adept at detecting and disrupting large-scale terrorist plots, potential attackers have instead turned to smaller scale, less sophisticated assaults. In part, this trend reflects a decision by wider extremist groups to adopt lone actor terrorism as a tactic, with both Daesh and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula trying to inspire their supporters to carry out such attacks. In other cases, individuals, dyads or triads judge that a lone actor attack will have greater chance of success, or perhaps lack connections to wider networks. Whatever the case, there's a growing trend of individual or small cells acting in isolation from a wider group to conduct terrorist activity. Now, they point out that there have been 98 plots and 72 attacks in 20 European countries. They say that 94 people were killed and 260 injured in attacks carried out by right-wing extremists across Europe between 2000 and 2014. They say 16 deaths and 65 injuries caused by religiously inspired lone wolf attacks. They say that security agencies are not as good at detecting right-wing extremism as they are at detecting religiously motivated terrorists, and that intelligence, quotes, may currently be more finely tuned to dealing with Islamic terrorism. They say that there are clear implications for policymakers and for law enforcement. And they say that right-wing extremists represent a substantial aspect of the lone actor threat and must not be overlooked. So I'll just point out that this project was co-funded by the Prevention of and Fight Against Crime Programme of the European Union. So it's an EU-funded project. And other partners included Chatham House, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, Leiden University, and one of the founding organizations was the International Center for Counterterrorism at The Hague. And then they've got some associates, the Dutch National Coordinator for Security and Counterterrorism, the Association of Chief Police Officers, which is now the National Police Chiefs Council, and also the Polish Institute of International Affairs. So there you go, a very international thing. Now, this project has been running for quite some time. This is the 11th report. But I don't think, Brian, it's a coincidence that this report is released within a day or two of the Joe Cox murder.
Well, I find it fascinating, Mike, and also, of course, yesterday we were picking up reports that apparently Jo Cox herself was about to release some form of document talking about extremist groups and hate groups, and I wonder whether this could actually be the document which has now morphed into RUSI. But what an amazing organisation RUSI is, because this is the organisation that at the moment is advising the British government on how British defence policy should be run. It's a group of academics, essentially, and they're casually saying, well, never mind what the security services say, we, RUSI, don't think they're capable of dealing with the right-wing extremist lone wolf issue. That's a pretty arrogant statement for this organisation to make, unless they're actually very well informed on who these people are, which is what I expect is going on.
Yes. Well, look, let's just remind ourselves where the money from the Joe Cox fundraiser is going to. The first thing on the list, the Royal Voluntary Service, they're saying that these volunteers are helping combat loneliness in Joe's constituency.
Really?
Really, yes. I just want to remind everybody the report that we made a week or so ago about volunteers and what the voluntary sector is being really organised to do. We had Volunteers Week a week or so ago, the big celebration, and this is about pushing forward the change agenda as change agents. And let's just remember that what David Blunkett said a few years ago. We need a different relationship between government and the governed, between people and elected representatives, and between civil society and formal politics. The RUSI report, RUSI as an organisation, really epitomises this attitude to governance, doesn't it? Because this is about these non-government organisations pushing policy into. I mean, he's standing in front of a policy exchange, perhaps appropriately signed there, but this is the change between civil society and formal politics that they're pushing so hard.
Yes, it's not what individual members of the public say under some form of democracy. What we've got is NGO, third sector organisations and charities who are the primary source of policy. What they say is what is adopted into government. So Blunkett, many people say, very, very dangerous politician, and was during his time as a working MP. But of course, we shouldn't forget Eric Pickles, who said that he was an, quote, unlikely revolutionary. Well, of course, this is exactly what's going on here. This is what big society is. And for people who think the end of the story is the European Union, oh no, it's not, because the ultimate agenda is communitarianism, which is going to be a pretty vicious police state.
Shall we move on?
Well, we'll carry on with the theme because, of course, many people in the press are now pointing out that the death of Jo Cox is being very cynically used in order to push a political agenda. So the BBC picking up on Nigel Farage here, saying that the Prime Minister is trying to link Jo Cox killing to the Brexit campaign. That's exactly what the Prime Minister has been trying to do. There was a video clip attached to this BBC report. That's the smaller inset image. And I was just fascinated in what the BBC opened with. The death of Jo Cox has forced a pause in the fiercest of campaigns, to which I say, what campaign? Because if I look around the country at the moment, I can't see a campaign. I can see some blurred discussion about whether we should be in or out of the European Union. But we will just remind our viewers and listeners of what we've reported before. This was from some weeks ago. We talked about a cross-party scam to confuse and break up the real Leave Europe vote. And what we showed is this bizarre network of links between the various organisations that are apparently working to do one thing or the other. And as we dug into it, it's just not clear who is who in this very strange mix of organisations supposedly working to get us out, but including people who want us in. How does it work? Well, let's take it a step further, and we've labelled this one how the European EUReferendumPsyOp works. And this is the key, that behind the scenes there's a cross-party agenda controlling both the in and the out camps. So we've got the labels: Brexit, Remain, Vote Leave, Stronger In. If we just put in some of the other background organisations, the first thing we see is that on the Leave side, it's all become rather confused who's who. So we've got those other organisations apparently all working together, but they're not really. So bring in the big guns. Boris Johnson, we say, where's his loyalty? Conservative, city, corporatist interests. Mike, anything else we should list?
I think his loyalty is himself. He sees himself as being the next Prime Minister, and that's as far as it goes.
Absolutely. Well, we've got Michael Gove, and I'm going to quickly label him conservative, but his loyalty, he's declared publicly on stage in London, is to the Zionist Israeli government. So how he's representing UK, I'm not sure. Baroness Wolsey, well, she's just loyal to herself and the Conservatives. And we better bring in Nigel Farage. Not quite sure where he fits in this, but he's in that little confused mess. And this man, who isn't really getting a mention, but people need to have a look at him very closely, Dominic Cummings. This was the man who was involved in the demonstration in CIB where a fake company had been set up, so dirty dealing. Well, who's leading the in? Well, of course, it's the government. David Cameron, who's also declared that he's a supporter of the Zionist Israeli government, is looking after the interests of Britain. He's got his little teddy bear, George Osborne, with him. Who's George working for? Well, the corporatist interests, so he's not working for Britain. And then we've got supposed heavyweights like Lord Rose, who's big in, what, lingerie, third floor.
Yeah.
And all of these people are working for the city interests. Wild cards. Nicola Sturgeon wants independent for Scotland, but only as a vassal state of the European Union. Jeremy Corbyn was against the EU. He's suddenly for it, so he's in. And of course, the wild card is Will Straw, with no background or substance, but running the whole campaign. And, oh yes, Wazi hopped across, didn't she?
Or not.
Or not. And at the bottom, we better put the other control structure, which is simply the money. So we've got huge banking interests, Goldman Sachs, Citibank, hedge funds supporting the Remain, but we've got big money interests supporting the out. And we're just bringing the elephant in the room. This was from leave.eu. Quite an interesting poster because, of course, Cameron and George Osborne here are apparently heading towards global trade. That's what it says on the sign. EU elephant in the room, but the EU is being run by those global interests. So presumably they're going to go on a circular bike ride.
Actually, it should be the global trade sign, which is the elephant, to be honest.
Okay, well, we'll just finish it off because we are saying that basically Vote Leave is exactly the same as Stronger In.
We should also mention probably that Will Straw is the son of Jack Straw, so there's no sort of nepotism in that.
I haven't forgotten that bit, Mike. We'll just run on through.
Okay.
So here's Eric Pickles back in November 2015, getting very excited that Vote Leave had set up a back company to hold this demonstration at CBI. Have a look at the text on that because it mentions Dominic Cummings. And many people are saying, who is this man? Very cold, calculated. Here's Ms. Wazi. Apparently she said she wouldn't get on a night bus with Michael Gove. I wonder how many buses she gets on at night, Mike.
None, I would have thought.
Not very many. Yeah. We wouldn't get on a bus with either of them. David Cameron, well, he's just told the British people, never mind the British people, he's working for the Israeli government effectively. So here's all the glad handing. And he said that, of course, every child in Britain has got to learn about the Holocaust. A big issue for Hope Not Hate, actually, Mike.
Yes,
So
yes,
not
indeed,
surprised to see them in. And just in case you thought I'd forgotten, here he is, Will Straw. He's been accused of morally unacceptable plot to use Joe Cox's death, which seems a spot-on headline, really. And we'll bring in Daddy. And let's remember that Daddy was caught in a cash for access sting, but he was also the man who tried to put a ban on children being abused in care from speaking to the media. And I wonder why you would do that. Where does that take us?
I don't know.
Well, let's have a look at what the polls are saying, because I've been complaining I've not been seeing a lot, and I found this, the Brexit Index, and it's a who's who of Remain and Leave supporters. Encourage people to go to this website. I know the text is a little bit small on screen, but who's voting Remain, and here's who's voting Leave. And then they basically do an analysis of a variety of areas, and this is the result. If you look at the top graph versus the bottom graph, the Leave voters are elderly. I say they're old fuddy-duddies. They're in general uneducated. They don't take foreign holidays. They are not in full-time education, and they have to live in horrible rented accommodation. But the interesting thing in this poll is there's no ethnic breakdown. And the reason I wanted to put that in is because if we come back to this image, which we showed, Jeremy Corbyn, of course, switching sides with Andrew Marr very easily, we brought in this man, Mr. Peter Sutherland, and he said the EU should be doing its best to encourage mass migration to undermine the homogeneity of European countries. So quite clearly, the message there is that if you can get enough people into the country, you can actually break down the nation state and skew the voting.
Yes.
And I think we've about summed it up, really.
Yes.
PSYOP.
A PSYOP, yes, indeed. But, you know, the rhetoric goes on both sides. So let's see what the financial industry is saying. So what have we got here? This is billionaire Peter Hargreaves speaking to Bloomberg. And he was asked some questions. Why do you support Leave? And he said every year in the EU it gets more political, it gets more legislative, more regulative. We don't seem to get very much benefit from it. We would be far better out. He was asked, how do you counter strong economist, analyst support to Remain? And he said there's a huge amount of vested interest. A lot of people making these comments are politically motivated and also work for big banks that aren't British. And he said, what happens to interest rates? Bloomberg said, what happens to interest rates with the Brexit? And the answer was, I don't think there'll be any change. One thing every country in the world is trying to do is to get the value of their currency down. That's why interest rates are low. It's quite likely the pound will come under a bit of pressure. Initially, it will go down, and that will be a compensation for any tariffs, so the tariffs won't bother us. So that's quite an important comment because of what happened this morning. Because, of course, George Soros, and you asked who George Osborne was working for, and I suspect it's another George. But Osborne today saying that George Soros, who predicted the fall in sterling on Black Wednesday, doesn't mention the fact that he caused the fall in sterling on Black Wednesday, is warning Brexit leads to Black Friday and makes us purr. So this is the article.
Threat to the nation state.
Absolutely, this is the article. The Brexit crash will make you all purr. Be warned. That's the headline from George Soros in The Guardian this morning. Absolutely superb. He's warning of serious consequences for British jobs and finances if the country leaves the EU. He's saying that sterling would decline precipitously. He's saying that the EU is costly, bureaucratic, and blind. This is a counter comment from the Vote Leave chief Matthew Elliott to the impact it has had on people's wages and soaring energy bills. But as we noticed a couple of minutes ago, a British billionaire saying a slight decline in sterling would do us no harm at all. But Soros said that leaving the EU would see sterling fall by at least 15%, possibly more than 20%. He said the value of the pound would decline precipitously. It would also have an immediate and dramatic effect on financial markets, investment, prices, and jobs. I would expect this devaluation to be bigger and also more disruptive than the 15% devaluation that occurred in September 1992, when I was fortunate enough to make substantial profit for my hedge fund investors. So there you go. So Vanessa, what do you make of this from George Soros? It is a direct threat, bearing in mind the impact this man has globally. He should be in prison.
Absolutely. I mean, if we're talking about his financial effects, let's say, but if we actually look at the fact that he's predominantly funding the majority of the NGOs that are acting either on the ground or remotely against Syria and working in lockstep with the US NATO agenda in the region, the majority of those NGOs, those media outlets, those producers of propaganda have, to a larger or greater extent or lesser extent, George Soros funding behind them. And we know, I mean, for instance, the Supporting Syria conference that was conducted in London in February of this year, we have photographs of George Soros meeting with various EU politicians and diplomats during that time. So we know that his puppetry, shall we say, is behind much of what is happening, both in the Middle East region, but globally as well, and now obviously in the EU. We know that he's directly involved in exacerbating and controlling the refugee crisis. So it's not surprising to hear this.
So what you're saying, and what he's saying in his own article, is that this man commits individually acts of war effectively against other countries. He gets away with it. It results in deaths, particularly in third world and Middle Eastern countries. But he actually does things which affect every single one of us. So we should be doing what we can to make sure, surely every one of us should be doing what we can to make sure there's some kind of criminal investigation into this man's actions.
Absolutely. And we know now through his Open Democracy site that he's influencing the BBC. So he's having a tremendous control both over the policies that govern our lives, but even actually there's a degree of mind manipulation going on via the media outlets and the NGOs and the various propaganda outlets that he is controlling. So yeah, he's a criminal and he should be prosecuted as such.
Yes. Okay. Well, let's come back to Philip Hammond then. Here he is, because he's talking about Libya today. This was the EU Foreign Affairs Council yesterday, and they were discussing support for the government of national accord in Libya, the Middle East peace process, and also the migration crisis. They were focusing apparently on Operation Sophia, which is the EU naval mission targeting illegal immigration into the central Mediterranean countries, and they agreed to extend Operation Sophia's mandate until July 2017. And he had said that the UK has always supported this extension of the Sophia mission. I hope we can get it agreed today. And then he said, then what we need to do is to provide a strong support to the government of national accord in Libya and help it to establish its legitimate control over the territory of Libya, while at the same time helping ourselves to shut down the illegal arms traffic and the people trafficking that is causing such disruption on the central Mediterranean. Operation Sophia has saved more than 13,700 lives. We're committed to maximizing Sophia's impact by seizing and destroying the traffickers' boats and identifying smugglers for arrest. But he doesn't say how many people have died. And once again, what we're seeing, aside from the actions of Soros, we're seeing the actions of governments and people like Philip Hammond in really denying what has caused these problems in the first place, Vanessa. And it's really up to individuals to try to hold these people to account.
I mean, we are actually this dreadful matter of Joe Cox is actually exposing even greater levels of depravity and perversion of humanity that I think any of us actually thought possible. The fact that our government is cynically manipulating and exploiting her death to, as we say, to raise money for their own assets that they are already funding to the tune of 19.7 million to be inside Syria. And then we hear this statement which, purports to be pro-refugee, pro-saving lives, when we know that there are actions across the region again, and particularly in Libya, which, if you like, the bombing of Libya started as far back as 1986 under Thatcher. So we've been instrumental as a country in the devastation and destruction of these countries, and we are now employing the refugee crisis as a weaponization, as a weapon. We're using immigrants and refugees as weapons within propaganda, but also as physical weapons inside Europe to destabilize Europe. So not only are we bombing, destroying and devastating these countries, we're then weaponizing the people that are fleeing those countries.
Vanessa, I think that's a particularly good point, because, of course, at the moment, as the tension builds in UK and obviously in other European countries, with the sheer number of people moving across boundaries, tension increasing, people beginning to get angry, and then the government cynically turns around and says, well, anybody who points a finger at immigration is an extremist and full of hate. Yeah. But our own government, as you say, our own governments are the very people who are cynically causing the pain and suffering of these people that are having to move as a result of wars or economic synergy. So these are very cold, calculating people. You see Philip Hammond there looking very smart in his suit and saying, well, we need to help sort out Libya. To me, psychopathic tendencies are coming to the fore with these people. The lies and their behaviour appalling. I'll just add as well that, of course, in Libya, who was sent in to help rebuild the Libyan public sector? None other than political charity Common Purpose, funded out of the European Union. So we know that, of course, what they're building, or trying to build in Libya at least, is a controlled structure. I've raised a number of points there. You can come back on in any one, but I just think that the use of immigration for this political agenda of war and corporate profit is really, well, I'm lost for words.
Yeah, no, I'm the same. I mean, as I said, the level of perversion of all humanitarian values that we're seeing by our own psychopathic regimes, and you're quite right. There's a huge level, and actually, we've only seen this level of projectionism from the illegal state of Israel in the past, from the Zionists, who are renowned for projecting their own misdeeds and their own criminal actions onto those that they're oppressing and brutalizing. But actually, what we're now seeing from our own governments is exactly that same level of projectionism. They're projecting onto those who, you like, are dissenting their policies. They're projecting onto us and calling us fascists and neo-Nazis and the rest of it. But actually, they are upholding and putting through fascist policies globally. And, I have to come back to, I've mentioned in the 21st Century Report, the year 2000 report produced by the Rand Corporation, which was entitled Swarming and the Future of Conflict. Now, it may be some sort of, part of my imagination that says, is that why Cameron alluded to the refugees as swarms, if you remember in the very beginning, that created these shockwaves of how dare he? But had he simply, used that word because that is the word that they are using? In other words, if we look at it, it's the emergence of, I'm quoting now, the emergence of a military doctrine based on swarming pods and clusters. So in other words, we're seeing it into Syria via the white helmets that are swarms and clusters that are being placed into strategic areas geopolitically inside Syria. There's a new pod, if you like, that has just been set up in the Damascus countryside. But are we seeing it also the other way? It's an interesting thought, and if we actually read that report in full, it does relate very much to what is happening. We're seeing the weaponization of the refugee crisis, and we're seeing them being used cynically to destabilize Europe. So I think we're seeing this swarming and the future of conflict being used cynically by our governments on both sides, both in the countries that are producing the refugees because of our government's intervention, and then in our own countries when we are being forced to receive the fallout from our government's policies. And then we're called fascists for pointing that out.
Yes, well, Vanessa, a subject that we've discussed recently is what is going on in Syria with regard to Russia. And this Sputnik article here I wanted to highlight because they're saying quite clearly that Russia is losing patience with the US in particular over Syria as the situation deteriorates. I just want to read a little of this. It says, earlier this week, US media cited an anonymous official who claimed planes of the Russian aerospace forces had hit the positions of US-backed Syrian opposition forces. Russian and US defense officials held a rare video conference overnight to address the issue. And the Russians are saying, you know, it is us, not Americans, who are losing patience concerning the situation in Syria. We are fully meeting our commitments and agreements on securing the ceasefire and national reconciliation in Syria. And they're saying that Russia has been sending coordinates of targets of the Islamic State and the al-Nusra Front to the United States for 3 months, while the United States cannot, they say, still determine which armed groups belong to terrorists and which belong to the Syrian opposition. As a result, the Russians are saying terrorists are actively restoring their strength and the situation is escalating again. Now,
well, that makes sense, Mike, doesn't it? Sorry to interject there.
Absolutely, but Vanessa, you know, we were in the past discussing how Syrians viewed the Russian withdrawal, in inverted commas. Hasn't been a full withdrawal, but nonetheless they've stepped back from much of what they were doing before. They're clearly losing patience with the situation as it has developed. Was this another flanking maneuver by the Russians to really expose what the Americans are doing? And I'm particularly interested to know how Syrians view what's happening and whether they think the Russians will re-escalate their activities in Syria.
I think generally Syrians are getting frustrated themselves. Well, actually, frustrated is probably a euphemism for how they feel. I think it was yesterday, there was also a Sputnik report detailing new attacks, despite the supposed ceasefire, from the al-Nusra and assorted terrorist gangs in the east of Aleppo, renewed attacks on the west of Aleppo, which we know is the government-held areas or the Syrian state-held areas that houses the majority of the Aleppo civilians, over 1.5 million. So the frustration levels are rising in the sense that they don't want any more ceasefires. They actually now don't want this continued policy of the US of protecting certain factions within the terrorist brigades, i.e. al-Sham, which they're refusing point blank to designate a terrorist organization, despite the fact that it is very clearly affiliated to al-Nusra, which is al-Qaeda in Syria, and it has been happily carrying out massacres of Syrian civilians, including the hideous suicide bombing in Latakia and Tartus, the two coastal towns, which was a massacre of Syrian civilians, and which the Western media tried to portray as ISIS, whereas in fact al-Sham have taken responsibility. So the US is continuing to protect its assets. It's continuing to refuse to cooperate with Russia on the ground and to give them details of which targets they can hit. So I think here we saw Russian frustration levels rising. They informed the United States, so this was not a surprise attack, but they did inform the United States that they were intending to attack these areas in the south and to target US assets on the ground, whether they are al-Nusra or al-Sham, Jaish al-Fatah, whatever other faction you wish to call them. At the end of the day, it's about brand names, and it's about the US trying to protect their own proxy armies on the ground in Syria. And that is where now I think the frustration from the Syrian people is reaching an extremely high level, and to some extent, I think they hope that the ceasefires will be completely dismantled, and the Syrian Arab Army allowed to just go back to doing what it should be doing, which is cleansing Syria of all terrorist factions and not relying upon the United States to arbiter over who is terrorist and who is not.
What's going to happen when Russia finally does lose patience? Do you think they will re-escalate their activities?
Russia is continuously on a knife edge, and I think this has to be understood. It has to, at all costs, avoid being the trigger to what is potentially a world war situation. Because if they provoke, Russia has severely been provoked, as we know, throughout the time of its intervention in Syria. From the downing of its jets in the Sinai to the downing of its fighter jet in Syria by Turkey. So we're seeing a continuous provocation of Russia. We're also seeing a buildup of NATO troops along the Russian border. So we know that Russia, to some extent, is the target. So it has to play a very cautious game in this. But at some point, it is going to be pushed to take greater action, because at the end of the day, if Syria does fall, the next target is Iran, and then we're talking about being right on the Russian borders.
Yes, well, okay, well, we'll move on a little bit related, because this is the new US ballistic missile, cruise missile, which they're trying to get funding for at the moment. There was a move here to defund that program, and that was defeated in the House. However, some senators, we've got Dianne Feinstein here and Ellen Trouscher, really saying that this new cruise missile isn't required. All it does is update the United States nuclear capability at a time where perhaps, politically, with regard to Russia, this is not the best thing to be doing. So what's interesting about this missile, this long-range standoff missile, Brian, is it can carry nuclear or conventional warheads, but this doesn't quite fit in with the sort of nuclear non-proliferation agreements, which sort of suggest that we shouldn't be developing, or the West shouldn't be developing, new capability in this area.
A confused situation,
Yes.
Mike. I don't know enough about the respective systems, but if you've got redundancy in a delivery system, usually the big agenda is how do we cut money? So you get rid of one. People are saying we don't want to. There must be more to it than meets the eye. But the bit that caught my eye in that report was the fact Obama was saying, I think in Hiroshima, that he can foresee a future free of nuclear weapons. Now, why do I think that's significant? I think that's significant because if you are en route to a one world government system, that is exactly where they want to get to. You do not want nuclear weapons because they are a game changer, whoever has them. So I wonder whether Obama is actually moving on in the big game plan, which is we're actually maneuvering big pieces on the board now to try and get nuclear weapons in a very small number of hands. And we've consistently said that, of course, Britain is to be stripped of a nuclear weapon capability. That will be taken over by the French. So I think that's the best answer I can give until we got some more information. What's happening, not sure.
Right. And finally, for me, though, on this subject, Russia, according to RT, has successfully test-fired anti-ballistic missile systems. So this is a short-range anti-ballistic missile system, which is designed to shoot down or at least deal with US or any enemy's nuclear ballistic missiles. This launch was to verify performance characteristics, apparently. It was operated by the Russian Air Force, and they're saying the missiles are put into a capsule used for launches of sea-based Tomahawk missiles. They are placed, they're talking about the US, of course. Now they're placing their anti-missiles there, which is capable of engaging a target at a distance up to 500 kilometers.
And I believe these are the hypersonic missiles where
Right.
Russia at the moment seems to be stepping out ahead of the Americans, but I'll stand corrected on that. Do we give Vanessa? Would you like just to respond on that at all, or not?
It's not a story that I've actually been following, but I mean, you know, what is extraordinary is yet again, the United States in particular, as regards nuclear armament, is projecting onto every other nation, apart from, of course, Israel, that has never questioned over its nuclear capability, but over every potentially hostile nation, such as Iran or Russia, as to what and what capability they should be allowed to have. While they themselves can run with the ball as far as they want to.
Precisely. Okay, thank you. Well, just an ending topic, really, that we shouldn't take our eyes off the small and simple things while we're considering these very big geopolitical problems. And we'll come right down to Devon and Cornwall Police. And thank you very much to the person who said, well, we're aware of this little tweet, which is Devon and Cornwall Police effectively making fun of locking people in cages. So we've got a relatively small van here. It says, on the Cathedral Green, Exeter today for the Cathedral School fete, come and get locked up. And then we're showing a picture, which is, it looks like a cage suitable for dogs. I don't know about people. This is the same Devon and Cornwall Police that have got a record for strip searching women who go to the police to report the crime of fraud. They get angry when you report child abuse to them, and they specialise in taser work, in particular tasering a man who was covered in petrol, and yes, he burnt and died. We wonder whether these matters will be addressed by the Common Purpose Police Commissioner, but apparently not, because her priority at the moment is independent custody visitors, so getting the public to do the job for her, I wonder, Mike.
I have to admit that that's quite disturbing.
I think so.
Yes.
Well, that brings us to the end of today's news. Vanessa, thank you very much for joining us. I think we're beginning to get to the bottom of the EUReferendumPsyOp. And of course, it's important that as much factual information as possible goes out before the referendum on the 23rd. While we've been live today, in our chat box, people have been discussing a man called Bernard Kenny, I think, who is apparently implicated somewhere in the Joe Cox case. And they're saying this is remarkable because this particular man died in 2013. So we'll leave our viewers and listeners to do a bit of research in that. But there is something not right over the sad death of Joe Cox. We will be back at the same time tomorrow.
Alex Thompson with us, I believe.
With Alex Thompson. And thank you for joining us. And do consider subscribing or making a donation. We can only do what we do with your help. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.